My name's Rob Brown. I'm the head of journalism at Falmouth University and the editor-in-chief of truthval.com, which some of you hopefully are familiar with already, or certainly will be hopefully in the near future. Basically, this is an online showcase for our students and sometimes our staff's communicative and creative talents. And also it provides an alternative view, hopefully, of life here in South Cornwall. So tune in to Truthval. It'll be getting a big proper launch in the new year. And we want to be truthful, or truthful sometimes even, about lots of things around here, but also in the wider world. And one place that I think we really do need to certainly know what's going on and being as truthful as possible is Russia. We're very fortunate this evening to have with us a man who has immersed himself in life in Moscow and other parts of what is, after all, geographically anyway, the largest country in the world, and certainly, as you can see from recent news headlines, one of the most interesting. Some people would say one of the most meddling. Some people would even say it's the country that decided the US presidential election. But don't try telling that to Donald Trump or any of his associates. But seriously, the band tonight, by the way, I should explain that we're both Scottish, and when Scots get together, we do tend to get, our accents tend to get even stronger. So we'll try and control that in case you need subtitles along the bottom here by the end of the evening. But seriously, the man here is someone that I actually used to follow. I'm not much younger than him, but I did used to follow him a lot in his reports, even before I knew who he was. Angus Roxburgh has basically covered Russia in one way or another, or been associated with Russia for almost half a century, 45 years. I mean, I know he doesn't look old enough for that to have happened. He's met 4 successive Russian presidents, and being jinxed by a Siberian shaman. Not many people can say that. Not many people can say shaman properly either. And he's come under fire in war zones. He's been arrested by Chechen thugs. And during the Cold War, he was wooed by the KGB, the notorious spy agency, who then decided that he would make a lousy spy, and so they expelled him from the country instead. I should say he's worked most of the time, and the reason his wonderful new book, by the way, I'll give it a little plug here.
Please do.
That's why he's here after all. Moscow Calling, a wonderful Christmas stocking filler.
Absolutely.
The perfect present for that awkward relative who you don't know quite what to get them. Get them a copy of Moscow Calling. That'll shut them up on Christmas Day. But seriously, it is a wonderful book. And Angus, I should also add, his major involvement or immersion in Moscow was as the correspondent there for both the Sunday Times and indeed for the BBC for many years. But, and we're going to cover this, Angus, he did cross over to the dark side at one point. He went and started doing PR for Putin's regime, would you believe? It's not, I think, the most glorious period in his life, but he's going to explain why that came about, hopefully. But anyway, there you have it. Someone who has met 4 Russian presidents, been under fire in war zones, Chechen thugs, KGB, Putin's pin doctor, just really an average sort of guy. So, seriously, Angus, how did you get into all this Russia stuff?
Well, thanks for that introduction, Robin. Thank you, Falmouth, for laying on hailstones this afternoon when I arrived, just to get me in the mood for talking about Russia. How did I get onto Russia? That sounds the easiest thing, I think, to illustrate that might be to read a little bit from the introduction to my book, when I describe what it was that got me hooked and led me to end up spending the rest of my life, basically one way or the other, involved with Russia. So I'll just read it just for 5 minutes from the beginning. Little did I suspect back in 1970, when I first closeted myself in the school library for hours on end to teach myself Russian, that the rest of my life would be shaped by a country of which at the time I knew very little. It was communist, had put a man in space, and had athletes with CCCP on their shirts. That was about it. Oh, and everyone was scared of it. But it was none of these things that first ignited a Russian spark inside me. No, it was a beautiful tawny wooden box that sat on my bedroom table, a Pi wireless set with 5 valves, 8 wave bands and 4 Bakelite knobs, which I twiddled ceaselessly, entranced by the world's languages, voices and music. The signal from the USSR was the clearest and most powerful on the ether. Inexplicably, the very sound of it made my heart jump. The 10-note call sign pealed like frozen iron bells being struck on a black winter night. At the start of every broadcast, a voice would declaim, "Говорит Москва." Just 2 words, but they quivered with emotion, and they mean Moscow calling. Then a choir struck up a Russian song that haunted me almost as much as the spine-tingling opening bars of Good Vibrations, which was around at the same time. I didn't know then, but I know now, that the song was a classic piece of Soviet propaganda. Here's a rough translation. "Wide is my motherland, full of rivers, fields and trees. I know of no other country where people breathe so free." The station, Radiostanция Rodina, or Radio Motherland, broadcast in Russian and was mainly targeted at what it called our compatriots abroad. I had no idea what was being said, but I luxuriated in the euphony of the language, its dark, soft, sexy vowels, the clatter of its consonants, the susurrus of its fricatives and sibilants, the music of its intonations. Folk songs spirited me to Siberia. Readings of poetry, even if I understood no word, left me breathless at their beauty. Perhaps my subconscious was telling me lips that produced such heavenly sounds surely had to be kissed. I sent off for the booklets that accompanied the station's Russian lessons. Meanwhile, in an Edinburgh bookshop, I bought what must surely be the most unsuccessful textbook ever published. Titled Teach Yourself Russian Through Reading, it aimed to plunge learners straight into the delights of Russian literature, to wit, in the very first chapter, a passage from Tolstoy's War and Peace. Thus, the first Russian sentence I ever tried to learn was, "When Prince Andrew entered the study, the old prince in his old man's spectacles and white dressing gown, in which he received no one but his son, was sitting at the table writing. He looked around." From such texts, one was supposed to assimilate Russian grammar. And by the end of lesson 1, we'd done reflexive verbs, past tenses, possessive pronouns, and several conjugations, and learned interesting phrases such as, "The splutters flew from his creaking pen." I struggled on for a few more pages, but was thankful when the Radio Moscow booklets finally arrived, and I was soon practicing more useful sentences such as, "Hello, my name is Victor. This is my house, and my mum is a crane operator." I go on to explain some of the other thing at that time in the 1970s, of course, was that the Soviet Union was a mysterious place. It was communism, the Iron Curtain. In 1968, they invaded Czechoslovakia. And all of that sort of made me just wonder, what on earth is this huge country about?
Right.
And, I wanted to learn that.
We're going to look at, in a second, a little film showing it's the sort of album, Christmas album of Angus working for the BBC in Moscow. I didn't explain, by the way, he used to be called Victor and he used to be a crane operator as well. Introduction. We'll explain that. But seriously, here is Angus Roxburgh reporting from Moscow for the BBC.
We flew into Chechnya on a Russian military helicopter, its rocket pods fully armed, even though this is territory allegedly under their total control. On the horizon we could see and hear the Russian bombardment of Chechen villages. The town of Shelkovskaya is one of the luckier ones. The Russians occupied it without first bombing it because the few Chechen fighters here left in advance. But people told me other villages were being flattened by Russian warplanes and artillery. The bandits are killing my soldiers, says General Troshev, the commander of the Eastern Front. They're murdering and shooting. What do you expect me to do? Stand back and watch? The Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin flew down to view Chechnya from the safety of another Russian-held town, Znamenskaya, which has always opposed the independence fighters. At a news conference, he confirmed his hard-line position that the Chechen guerrillas he calls terrorists will be liquidated. I asked him how he could do that without endangering civilian lives by storming the capital, Grozny.
Civilians are leaving. We will do everything we can to make sure there are no civilians in areas of military action.
So did that mean once Grozny was emptied of ordinary people, the Russians would take the city by storm? I'll tell you about that some other time, he said. A fair indication that this is precisely the plan. They rely on reindeer for everything. They use the skins to keep warm and eat every part of the animal, from the brain to the entrails, much of it raw. There are less than 30,000 evenks left. They're one of 20 original Siberian peoples now on the verge of extinction. Volodya looks after one of 21 reindeer herds scattered around this region. The distances are huge here. The helicopter couldn't land near his tent, so we have to travel there by reindeer-drawn sleigh. Seeing their living conditions, it's easy to understand why the evenks have an extraordinarily high alcoholism rate and average lifespan of only 45. Almost half of the deaths are by suicide.
I wouldn't wish this kind of life on my enemy. Sometimes you wake up in the morning and it's 60 degrees below. Evenks lived like this 200 years ago, and nothing's changed.
As evening falls, a shaman, or witch doctor, invokes spirits from the upper planet. One wonders whether such traditions can ever be reconciled with modern civilization. The herdsmen themselves say they want to live in the forest, but they'd also like a few creature comforts. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, Siberia. The Davedin cows, oblivious to the revolution going on around them, can look forward to the latest in automated milking technology, which the new boss wants to introduce, to replace his old-fashioned milkmaids with their buckets. But the demise of the old collective farm is not universally welcomed.
I am very worried by it all. How can we survive if we all get divided up? What if the tractor drivers all end up on a different farm from us?
This village is one of the first to be decollectivized. It'll be followed over the next few years by thousands more all over Russia. But instead of inspiring the villagers with hope for the future, land privatization, it seems, fills many of them with dread and confusion. There's little to suggest the sell-off will be a big vote earner in Sunday's election. Most peasants will find themselves no better off, and the new private bosses may be less tolerant of slack work and hard drinking than the old ones were. All in all, no great reason yet to cheer the return of capitalism to Russia's villages. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, in central Russia. Too embarrassed to tell me his name, this man is one of 12 million Russians who receive the minimum pension, just 1,000 rubles a month, less than £2. He gathers old cardboard from offices around town, which he can sell to supplement his tiny income. His pension is only enough to buy one loaf of bread a day, some milk every other day, and to pay the small rent on his room in a communal flat, which he shares with other families. He treats the rags and the old paper he collects with almost loving care. He sorts it, flattens it, and ties it up neatly as though it was something precious. For him, it is. Since Mr. Yeltsin introduced market reforms and abandoned the social levelling of the communist era, the number of poor people has soared. 1/3 of Moscow's population consider themselves under the breadline. The characters include a typical Russian babushka or grandmother, an intellectual whose job is under threat, a factory worker and a plumber who's too fond of the bottle. Most people have forgotten that The Archers was originally started up by the Ministry of Agriculture as an educational programme. Russia's first radio soap will also bring a message into people's homes, but only very indirectly.
I should explain, by the way, that there was a time in Scottish schools where it was quite fashionable to be taught Russian. I remember I got a choice between Latin and Russian, and for some crazy reason, probably something to do with a fixation with the Romans, I chose Latin. But
well, those were the days people could do it. Nowadays, Russian isn't taught in a single Scottish school. I don't know about what it's like in English, but it's just the interest has completely disappeared, which seems pretty tragic and short-sighted at a time when people really need to know Russian, you know.
Yeah, and you didn't just learn it at the school, you actually went on to Aberdeen University and studied Russian. Should explain to anyone who hasn't been there or taken the train all the way from Penzance up to Aberdeen. Aberdeen, even by Scottish standards, can be freezing in the winter. But even an Aberdonian winter probably didn't prepare you, Angus, for going to Moscow in 1978, where you arrived, I understand, into what had been the coldest Moscow winter for a century.
It was. I mean, that
sounds really cold.
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I arrived in Moscow in October of '78, and it was already getting pretty cold. We were put into. I was working for a Soviet publishing house. Which was very unusual in those days for foreigners at all to go and live in the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain. If you weren't a diplomat or a journalist, there was no reason for anybody to be there. And so I was working for this state publishing house, and they put us into an absolutely ordinary block of flats in the outskirts of Moscow, which had just been built. The whole area had just been built. There was one supermarket there for 30,000 people. And the shelves, not surprisingly, were always empty. But when we got there, the flat had scarcely been finished. The first thing we had to do was to finish putting in the bolts in the windows to make sure the glass wasn't going to fall out, because there was a gale blowing through them. And by the end of that year, 31st of December, it was literally the coldest day in living memory. It was minus 40 in the area where I was living, and it was exhilarating, it has to be said, but unbelievably cold. And what I loved about it was the different sound that snow makes. When it's a certain temperature, it sort of swishes when you walk through it. Then it begins to crunch. Then the temperature goes down another 10 degrees and it creaks. And then it gets to minus 40 and it squeals at you as if it's saying, why the hell are you out here in this cold? You know, it's just bitterly cold.
You must have been asking that yourself at some
Absolutely.
point. Why the hell am I here? Aberdeen would have seemed tropical at this point.
Indeed.
But tell me also about the other thing that would probably have freaked me out is all the cockroaches in the Moscow apartments.
God knows where they came from. I mean, this was, as I say, we were living in a brand new block of flats. It should have been completely clean. But because all the plumbing interconnects all the flats, of course, you know, the cockroaches get everywhere. And they drove us crazy. And I remember the first summer, when we were going back to Britain for a holiday, we thought, right, we're going to get rid of these things. And we sprayed everywhere with the best cockroach spray, all around the cupboards in the kitchen and around the pipes, the skirting boards, everywhere. Went away for 2 weeks, came back, and it was nice to see that there were lots of dead cockroaches on the floor, so we thought this must have worked. Incidentally, there was also a cigarette butt on the floor, which we knew meant that the KGB had been in during our absence, sort of going through our papers and belongings and so on. That was beside the fact that they also listened to our conversations, as we might mention that later. We discovered that. Anyway, we thought, well, we've killed the cockroaches off, swept them all away, and then we opened one cupboard in the kitchen, which of course we hadn't sprayed because it was where we kept our food and we didn't want to put poison in the food cupboard. So we'd emptied it, but not sprayed it. And we opened it, and it was just a seething mass of black cockroaches. And, you know, I mean, you can see, I remember once swatting a cockroach on the floor with a slipper or something, and just leaving it for a moment. And when I came back, there were thousands of tiny dots radiating from this one cockroach. It just shows how many one cockroach can produce. They're just an absolute plague. They say they're the only animal that would survive a nuclear war, and I believe it.
Right, and of course, when you were covering Moscow originally, and we were growing up, that was something that we associated with Russia, something that was a dread that we might indeed have a nuclear confrontation. It was the Cold War, and I mean, what was it like? Because there had been some sort of easing up, and obviously you covered the move into perestroika and glasnost under Mikhail Gorbachev, but nonetheless you did catch quite a good bit of that Cold War.
Oh, for 2 years I lived there in the coldest part of the Cold War, and you know, you really felt what it was like to live in a totalitarian society. You know, anybody who's read Orwell, 1984, or indeed Animal Farm, I mean, it really was like that. It was a system where the Communist Party attempted to control every aspect of people's lives. Whatever job you did, you came into contact with somebody from the Communist Party. Many people joined the Communist Party not because they believed in it, but because it was the only way to gain promotion and so on. At work, if you were a teacher, there would be a Communist Party cell in your school, and you would have to go along every week to political sessions and so on to learn about the Communist Party's policies, to learn about how awful the West was and so on. People couldn't travel abroad. And it occurred to me that if it wasn't for shortwave radio, in fact, the Communist Party really could have controlled the minds of Soviet people, because there were no foreign newspapers, there was no internet in those days. Everybody got their news from Soviet mass media, from the television, and only a few people, well, not a few actually, but you know, mainly intellectuals, people who wanted to know the truth, would try to listen to shortwave radio stations, to hear the BBC or the Voice of America crackling through the airwaves. I remember one night going to bed and just hearing the sound of the Voice of America, I think, call sign, and I'm thinking to myself, gosh, somebody in a neighbouring flat is listening to this. And it was forbidden. If the Communist Party bosses at his workplace had found out that somebody there was listening to a foreign radio station, that was enough to get you sacked or demoted, to lose any privileges you had.
Yeah, it's amazing to think, isn't it, that for a very long period, the Soviet Union was pretty much like the largest country in the world, and of course all its satellite states, which had an iron grip over, were pretty much like North Korea is today. And I mean, what was it then? I mean, obviously, you were controlled to a large extent as a journalist. You couldn't roam freely. So, what was the thrill, if you like, being a journalist then?
Well, of course, I wasn't a journalist then. I was working as a translator in those communist days. And the thrill then was just to be living in this totalitarian society that people didn't know about, you know. And you know, experiencing all sorts of things. For instance, you know, everybody knew that there was the news, anything that was published in the Soviet Union was censored. But I experienced that myself, for instance, when I translated a book about the composer Shostakovich. So they'd given me the Russian text of this book. It was a sort of biography of Shostakovich. And I translated it and handed it in to my control editor, whose job was to check my English against the Russian just to make sure I hadn't deviated from anything. And then we went through it together just to clear up any discrepancies. And I noticed at one point that she had put her pen through a sentence which mentioned the conductor, Kirill Kondrashin, who had performed the premieres of 2 of Shostakovich's symphonies. And I said to her, why have you done that? You know, I mean, isn't it quite important that people know who conducted the premiere of these works? And she said in a completely matter-of-fact way, she said, oh, didn't you hear he defected to the United States last week? And so, that was it. He was a non-person. He would never be mentioned again anywhere in the Soviet Union because he had betrayed the country by going abroad. So, you know, to feel that sort of thing happening to yourself really sort of brought it home. I mean, it's not as bad as another story that a friend of mine told me. Back in 1953, Beria, who had been Stalin's secret police henchman, was executed. Stalin had died, and a few months later Beria was executed. And just at that point, the great Soviet encyclopedia, a huge multi-volume work, had got to the letter B. So they published A, and they were on B, and there were about 5 pages about Beria, who suddenly became a non-person. And so what they did was the publishers of the encyclopedia sent a note to everybody who had received the volume so far with 5 new pages about the Bering Strait. With a little note saying, would you kindly use a razor blade to remove these 5 pages, leaving a little margin at the side and neatly glue in the new pages to cover the space. Incredibly. You know, so they were basically asking people to be their own censors, in fact.
I made my one and only visit to Russia, Moscow and Leningrad at the very tail end of communism. Gorbachev was in power. And the one thing that struck me when I was walking around was just how glum all the people were. And I remember saying to the tour guide, the in-tourist guide, who was of course controlled by the communist state, you know, why is everyone so miserable looking? Even by Scottish standards, they look miserable. And she said to me, with all seriousness, they are not miserable, they are not glum. Russian are far more serious people than you frivolous Westerners. They love opera, they love this and all that. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, maybe that's true, maybe we are just far too frivolous. And then I happened to be in Berlin while it was, the eastern half was communist. And I remember being in West Berlin, and there was a real mixture of facial expressions, such as you would find in any part of the West. And I crossed over the wall, and immediately everyone had all those glum expressions again that I'd seen in Moscow.
Yeah.
So just what it struck me about all of that was just day-to-day existence was bloody miserable, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. And that does explain why people were like that, certainly in public. And that's the impression you would get in all the communist countries in public. But at home, people were very different. And, you know, Russians at home laughed and smiled and joked just as much as anyone else does. In fact, what I came to realize was that there was the Russians had an expression for it. They called it internal emigration. So since the state was giving you nothing, your shops were empty, you were getting lies on television and in the newspapers and so on, people turned away from it and enjoyed quite a rich domestic life or internal life, if you like. You turned to your friends and your families and found enjoyment there, and found enjoyment in much simpler things. You know, it was quite a sort of simple society. The very fact that you couldn't just go out shopping, for instance, and buy whatever you wanted. You never planned what you were going to shop for. You know, in this country, if you decide you want a new iPod, you go out and buy one, or you know what meal you're going to make tonight, so you go out and buy the ingredients. There was no point in doing that in the Soviet Union because the shops probably would not have what you wanted. So you just went out with an open mind and bought whatever turned up and cooked whatever you could with those things. So that was difficult. And no wonder people looked glum in the streets. But as I say, there was this very rich life among friends, and especially the sort of the intellectual class. You know, they would read forbidden literature. All those books that the state censored or refused to publish circulated anyway from hand to hand, typewritten copies with, you know, done with about 10 carbons, so the last page scarcely legible. Music, songs that circulated on tapes that were recorded from one person to the next and so on. And that kept people going, you know. It wasn't at all unpleasant living in those circumstances at home. People
I loved your story about when glasnost, this was the Russian word for, I think, openness. Gorbachev had two great buzzwords that even I learnt these Russian words on top of my Latin, which were perestroika, which is restructuring, i.e. restructuring of the economy and society, and glasnost, which meant openness. And of course, suddenly there was some freedom of expression, and there was the editor of the Moscow News, which before then had just been parroting the party line. But suddenly, apparently, he used to say to his staff, your job is to write the stories that are could get me sacked. When I read that, I thought it was a bit like an editor-in-chief of Truthful, actually. But I won't go into that. But seriously, censorship was suddenly loosened up. And that must have been a really exhilarating...
Yeah. This was in the mid to late 80s. I went back to Moscow. So after working there as a translator, I came back to Britain for a few years. And then in 1987, I was appointed Moscow correspondent of the Sunday Times. That nice man, Andrew Neil, gave me the job. I arrived there in October 1987 to what just seemed to be the most amazing story in the world, because over the next 2 years, the whole communist system just began to crumble in front of your eyes, day by day. And so much of it happened thanks to newspapers like Moscow News that you just mentioned, and the fact that they were willing to publish things that hadn't been published before. I mean, it's strange to imagine what made news in those days. What makes news in Britain today? It's all the arguments over, the budget or Brexit and that sort of thing, hard politics. In the Soviet Union in those days, glasnost was what made news, and that meant that, somebody wrote something about Solzhenitsyn. And that was a huge story. Just,
or we're even talking about the past was in many ways.
Exactly. I mean, what Gorbachev did really was he told newspaper editors, especially his favourite ones on papers like Moscow News, look, we are basically living a lie. For 60, 70 years in the Soviet Union, we've been telling lies to the people about what our system is like, about what it's like in the West. We've got to start telling the truth or we'll never move on. And so they started by telling the truth about the Soviet past. So people like Trotsky or Bukharin, who had been one of Lenin's closest allies during the revolution, they had been non-persons throughout Soviet history, never ever mentioned. They never even got into the great Soviet encyclopedia, far less have their pages taken out. And suddenly, under Gorbachev, all that began to be unearthed and written about. And the consequence of that was that once you started talking about the past, then you started to talk about why the system didn't work, what was wrong with it today, why are the shops empty, why haven't we been able to listen to the BBC without it being jammed, and so on. And that, as I say, led within a couple of years basically to the collapse, not just of the communist system, but of the Soviet Union as well. And I want to distinguish between the two things there. There was the communist system that collapsed throughout the USSR, but then the actual Soviet Union began to collapse too. In other words, the Soviet Union, which consisted of Russia, the main part of it, plus all those other republics like Estonia and Latvia, Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan. Because of course what the people in those countries most wanted to talk about was their own national identity. They hadn't been able to express that in the Soviet period. So when Gorbachev said, write about whatever you want, what they wanted to talk about was, well, why are we living under Russian rule? Why are we being told in the Baltic republics that we voluntarily joined the USSR after the Second World War, when in fact we were occupied by Soviet troops? And so once people started talking about all of that, the system couldn't continue.
And again, it's what Orwell said in 1984, he who controls the present controls the past, controls the future. So this rewriting of history, in fact telling the truth about history, was a very political act.
Absolutely.
Now, if we fast forward quite a bit, the Soviet Union has disintegrated. Now, some of these groups which were asserting their ethnic identities That was done in various ways, but I think most tragically, or certainly the outcome was most tragic in a part of the former Soviet Empire called Chechnya.
Yeah.
Now, you covered that war, which I think it was certainly never probably came across to people in the West, no matter how many times you filed reports, just how brutal a conflict that was.
Yeah.
And one of the things that impressed me in your book was that you weren't grandstanding about this. You weren't, presenting yourself as the fearless, intrepid correspondent. You actually write quite honestly, I think, about the fear of war.
Yeah.
And so, can you explain just what it's like as a correspondent going into a really chaotic, almost anarchic situation like that?
Sure.
Wondering if you're going to come back.
Yeah. Just to put that in context, this is already 1994 to 96. Boris Yeltsin was president by then, and the Republic of Chechnya, down in the Caucasus Mountains in the south of Russia, had declared independence. But because it was part of the Russian Federation, Yeltsin sent his troops in to put an end to their bid for independence. And I was down there in December 1994 when the troops first moved in and the helicopter gunships started firing on Grozny, the capital, and so on. And it was strange in a way because I never set out to be a war correspondent. I never imagined ever that I was going to do that. You go to Moscow to cover a political story and enjoy doing that. And then you find that, one day you've been covering bread queues or, people in a homeless sort of a home for homeless people or whatever, all the different problems that were going on. And then there's this war starting up in Chechnya, and your editor asks you to go down there, and you don't really ask why. It's the next story on the agenda, really, And I remember, the first problem when you go into a place like that is finding somewhere to stay, and you generally end up staying with ordinary people. The Chechens themselves were incredibly hospitable. You could walk into any Chechen village, and if it was getting dark, somebody would always offer you their floor, or they would chuck somebody out of their bed and allow you to stay in their bedroom, and give you food and all that sort of thing. So they actually predisposed us very much towards themselves, actually, because they were so kind to us. But I remember we were all sleeping on the floor, I think a whole group of us, because a television crew, it's not just the correspondent, there's the cameraman, a producer, a picture editor, various other people. And we were sleeping on the floor one night in an ordinary house where the windows had tape over them because they obviously knew that the war was about to start and this would stop them breaking it with the sound of the planes going over. And you would just hear this sort of low rumble of planes overhead, and then a sort of poof, poof, somewhere in the distance, and it wasn't right where you were, but you sort of could feel it coming. And again, it was a sort of, I can't say, I'm not, I didn't feel terribly brave doing that at all. It was just, as I say, it was just another story, And then the next day, because you'd heard this going on, you would drive out to where it had happened, and you would drive into some village and see the destruction. Speak to people, film what had happened. Often there were bodies laid out, which they always wanted you to film. Often you couldn't show them on television, really, because it all looked pretty horrific. One village I remember where all the sheep had been burned, set alight by the bombs. And that's where the job becomes very hard as a war correspondent, because television relies on pictures. If you're writing about a situation like that for a newspaper, you can just conjure it up with your words. You don't have to go into it all that closely. You probably do, but you don't need to show it. But on television, you have to show what's going on. So the cameraman has to get in close, and you have to interview people about things that have just happened to them, and which are just the most horrendous things that can happen to human beings. To be honest, to be bombed, to have your children, your relatives killed, and that's definitely the most difficult part of being a foreign correspondent, I think. You film the devastated village, somebody's house that's a complete mess, and then you choose someone, very often the woman of the household or whoever, who you've been talking to off camera to find out what she's got to say. And then you're in this not very pleasant position of having to ask her to stand there in front of her destroyed house while the cameraman sets up his tripod with the camera and frames her properly, and we do a little voice check and all that. And then you start asking her about what has happened, you know, and who she's lost, the members of her families and so on. You feel as if you're intruding on people at the most vulnerable and awful moment in their lives, you know, and that's not great. But you know at the same time that if you want people at home to know what's going on there, you have to do this, because that's the reality, you know, you're showing what went on. It's interesting you were saying that war maybe didn't have great prominence in Britain. And I think it's because the Bosnian War was going on at more or less the same time, and that was closer to home somehow. NATO was involved in it in various ways. And
but that must be frustrating as a correspondent. When you're there, you can see how much carnage there is. You can see exactly how brutal the Russians, let's face it, and their allies, whatever, were being. Now, international news has been described as this sort of random searchlight that just pops around the world. That must be a real frustration for correspondents at times.
It is. I mean, if you're the one who's in that spotlight and covering the top story, it's fantastic, you know. And Chechnya was a big story. I mean, I wouldn't play it down. But one of the problems was that in Bosnia, there was a clear bogeyman. There was Milosevic, who, you know, nobody was sympathetic in the West towards him. The Russians were. But in Chechnya, it was different because this war was being prosecuted by Boris Yeltsin, who in other ways the West was supporting. You know, he was the first democratic leader of post-Soviet Russia, and the West wanted to support his reforms, and they kind of turned a blind eye to what was going on in Chechnya. And that's where I think, you know, I certainly felt that it was an important job to be doing, because we were showing day after day the horrendous consequences of Yeltsin's war, and trying to say, listen, this is the guy that you're supporting in Moscow in many ways, including helping to get him re-elected when his popularity was almost zero. But the West didn't really want to know. As far as I'm aware, the British embassy in Moscow during that first Chechen war never sent a diplomat down to Chechnya to see what was going on. Everything that people learned was through our reports and my colleagues.
I mean, being a foreign correspondent in particular requires quite an obsessive level of commitment. And one of the things you're quite honest about in your book was that at one point you felt you had a big dilemma, which was that you had been immersed in a story for quite some time, you'd been on assignment, but back in England, meanwhile, your third child was about to be born, and you actually asked the foreign editor, you know, what should I do? Should I stay here, or should I go back to see my baby being born?
I can't believe
most people in the audience would probably think that was crazy, but can you, I mean, what's your own reflections on that now?
Well, no, I can't believe that I even had that dilemma. Yeah, you know, there was a big story going on in Moscow, and I just felt, you know, that I knew what was going on there. You know, I was on the spot, and I knew that if I left, somebody would be sent out from London to cover it who wouldn't be quite as on the ball, you know, not as immersed in the story. And I just wondered, you know, well, I just discussed it with my foreign editor, and he said, "Don't be stupid. The birth of your next child is much more important than any story." And I said, "Yes, you're right, Vin. I'll go back."
And without getting too personal about it, probably I should point out this: a lot of foreign correspondents are divorced. They have these strains in their life, but it does take a personal toll, the sort of life you led. And I know you touch on it there in the book, but I suspect there's more to it than even you've wanted to go into.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about that?
What, more than is in the book? No. No, I mean, it does. I think a lot of, especially the war correspondent stuff, does take its toll on you psychologically. A lot of foreign correspondents suffer from post-traumatic stress. And some cope with it better than others. Again, in the book, I describe how, and again, it's awful, really. But I mean, have quite happy memories, really, of driving around Chechnya with a bunch of other reporters in the back of an armoured Land Rover, joking away about the things that we're seeing and doing and so on. And I think that was just a way of relieving the stress, really, and trying to get over it. So you find different ways of it, but it leaves something in you.
Right, but we do live in times now where thankfully people will speak very openly about mental health and indeed mental distress. I mean, you really did get burnt out a bit, didn't you, by this, and it did have an effect. Can you just say at least something about that?
Well, yeah, in a way, because it sort of helps to explain the next part of my career in a way. I remember because I moved to after most of the 90s I was in Moscow, and then I moved to Brussels as the BBC's Europe correspondent for quite a few years. But I used to also get sent off to Afghanistan, for instance, during that period. And I remember once coming back from Afghanistan just before Christmas, and going to a sort of ball, literally straight off the plane, going home, changing clothes, and going out to a school ball. And we were sort of sitting at tables there, eating this lovely food that was being served up for us. And people were saying, "Oh gosh, you're just back from Afghanistan, that must be amazing. Tell us about it." And you're just sort of so glazed over of having, jet lag apart from anything else, but also because of the things that you've just, I think the day before, I'd seen, and the only picture that could come into my head when people asked me what was it like was a sort of vision of two dead Taliban sort of wrapped around a lamppost. They'd been shot there and were just sort of lying there in the sun. And I couldn't think of anything else. And of course, at a Christmas party, you can't really bring that sort of thing up. So yeah, it leaves its toll. And I ended up with quite severe depression at one point. And to move on to the next bit of the story,
Going further into that,
yes.
You have explained it, but do you think that broadcast companies, as much as, say, the military, really now help their correspondents to deal with that?
I think they probably do. Because I'm talking about quite a long time ago, and no, I don't think they did much then. They paid lip service to it, but I don't think they did really. Nowadays, I understand the BBC does do that much more. They do try to. They're aware of the difficulties, and I think they do try to take care of people. Yeah.
And also there's been a lot of the hostile environment training.
Oh, there was even then, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, before any, no BBC journalists get sent into those sort of situations nowadays without having done a hostile environments course, where basically you go to some army base, usually somewhere in the south of England, with ex-squaddies there who know the whole thing. They've been in these situations themselves, and they teach you, how to look out for booby traps and IEDs and all that sort of thing. Even on one of them, they simulate a kidnapping, which is quite a horrific thing, where it's going to happen, and it's just pretend. But nonetheless, when you suddenly have a black sack pulled over your head and somebody's talking a foreign language to you and cocking a gun, it's quite real.
Yeah, I did one of these myself on the Brecon Beacons. Always ex-SAS men who do it. And it's partly for the media companies to get their insurance costs down as well. Yeah. I mean, it's a bit, personally I find it a bit gimmicky sometimes, but it can be good fun, depending on what you consider fun. But just moving on from that, so you went through what was obviously a dark period psychologically, and some people would say then you crossed over to the dark side, in the sense that you moved not just from journalism to PR and communications, which of course is a move a lot of media people make, particularly in these times, but you moved over to basically being a spin doctor, or helping to be a spin doctor for a foreign regime, the Russian regime, a regime that many people would consider an enemy of this state. Yeah. I don't get the impression you're proud of that, but can you explain it? Yeah,
less so. This was 2006, and Putin wasn't regarded in quite such a bad light at that point. Yes, I was going through this sort of low point, and two friends of mine who had also been journalists but they had set up a PR company in Brussels and landed this contract with the Kremlin. But they didn't have anybody on their staff who knew about Russia or about television work and that sort of thing. So they approached me and said, how would you like to come and work for us? And in that situation that I was in, I thought, well, this is a great opportunity to go back and do something about Russia again, use my skills and my knowledge about Russia. And of course I was aware, and I thought hard about it, because I was aware of what kind of regime we were talking about, although, as I say, it wasn't as bad then as it has become. But I sort of justified it in two ways, really. One was, as a journalist, it was a great opportunity because I was going to be working with Putin's spokesman and his team, his press team, advising them on how to communicate with the Western media. That was basically my job. Dmitry Peskov, yes. Yeah. So, it was an opportunity to see inside the Kremlin, to see how the whole thing worked. And that seemed quite a positive thing to do. And it led to the book I wrote before this one was called The Strong Man, which incorporates a lot of the information that I gathered during that period. So I was still basically working as a journalist on the side, while doing that. And secondly, it was, it was quite fun to work with these people who had a strange idea of how the Western media worked, to be honest. My job was to help Peskov, in particular, communicate with Western journalists. I spent a lot of time actually talking to people, my old colleagues at the BBC, arranging interviews for people like Bridget Kendall and so on, with Putin or with Medvedev and so on. And giving Peskov media training, so I would sit him in front of a television camera and throw the hardest questions I could at him, which actually was quite fun. It was like being Paxman with Putin's press aid.
You actually talked about at one point, I think it was an interview between Andrew Marr, my former boss at The Independent, and Dmitry Medvedev.
Yes.
And you sort of say that you actually scripted effectively
well,
the whole interview.
That's over-egging a little bit, yeah. In a sense, because President Medvedev, in that little 4-year period when Medvedev took over from Putin, had agreed to give an interview to the Andrew Marr show. So I was in touch both. I had to prepare Medvedev for the interview by telling him what questions to expect from Andrew Marr. Now, just as an experienced watcher of the Andrew Marr programme, but also as a former BBC journalist myself, I knew exactly what questions he was going to ask, and even basically what order he was going to ask them in. So I wrote all this down for Medvedev, and I gave him I put a little show reel together of clips from the Andrew Marr show, so that he could see what he was in for. And that was the legitimate part of my job. I think it's fair enough to let these people, and everybody has spin doctors like that who are preparing them for that sort of work. But at the same time, I spoke to Andrew Marr's producer and told him what sort of things I expected Medvedev would want to say. And so they got together for the interview, and I was sitting next to Medvedev's spokeswoman as the interview got underway. And of course it went exactly as I had predicted it would. Question, answer, and she sort of looked at me as if to say, how did you manage that, Right. And so I did feel as if I'd almost scripted the whole thing.
But I get the impression in that chapter, though, that you are slightly trying to absolve yourself of what you must, and I know we're looking back now, Putin wasn't quite as notorious then as he is now, that, it is a chapter you're obviously not proud of, and I get the impression you are slightly trying to absolve yourself. Well,
I was quite keen. Things happened that made me want to leave the job. For instance, when Anna Politkovskaya, the great Russian journalist, was killed in Moscow, and then Litvinenko was poisoned in London. And that made me really sort of think, it's difficult to do this job. And kind of about that point, I kind of deviated from the script, as it were, of the sort of things that the PR company wanted me to do, because I actually realised that what I could do was speak to Peskov, and through him hopefully to the very top leadership, about what I felt they really needed to do to improve their image, because the reason they'd taken a PR company on overall was to improve Russia's image in the West. And they thought they could do it by, for instance, paying journalists to write good stories about them, which of course was completely ridiculous, and I told them that that was ridiculous. And so I began to, and I wrote memos to them saying, for instance, that, the real reason people don't trust you in the West is because they think you haven't moved on from the communist period. You act as if you're still a communist country. You're beating up demonstrators. You're closing down television stations or programs that you don't like. What you really need to do, if you want to persuade the West that you've changed, is to really change. It's not the message that's wrong or needs tweaking, it's your actions. And I said, I had an opportunity once to speak to one of Putin's closest allies, a man called Gromov, who was in charge of Russian television. And I said to him, look, you're in charge of Russian television. Why don't you, for instance, if you want to prove that you're no longer a sort of quasi-Stalinist country, why don't you commission documentaries about Stalinism, about the communist period? Do what the Germans did about Nazism after the war, and really explain to people what went wrong and why it must never happen again. Distance yourself from that period.
Did they take up your suggestion?
No, what he said was, and it's quite interesting, he said, look, we can't do that yet because, and I think there's some truth in this, he said, still there are whole generations of Russians alive today who lived through that period, who lived through the communist period, who lived through the war with all the incredible suffering that Russians went through in the war. We can't suddenly turn around to these people and say, you lived your lives for nothing. It was all in vain. It was all a big lie. Because these people, that was their lives, And I mean, I took that with a bit of a pinch of salt, because after all, under Gorbachev and Yeltsin, they had begun to uncover the past and tell the truth about it. So he was moving back actually on that there. But he did have a bit of a point, and there are millions of ordinary Russian people who do look back nostalgically to the old system, because it was more stable. They all had jobs. There was no unemployment. Russia today is much more insecure for them.
Putin has been popular at times as well, we know that. But before I open it to Flora, I do want to cover one final area, which is, they might not have taken up your suggestion about the history programmes, but the Russian state, Putin's regime, has invested a colossal amount in RT, Russia Today, or RT UK as it's now called. And the station, you don't get very much about Russia on Russia Today, curiously enough, but you do get a lot of stuff that is, I think, obviously designed to destabilise the West, such as stories in RT that the Scottish independence referendum was rigged, and that really everyone voted for the breakup of Britain. But also we now have the man, a fellow Scot who used to be the First Minister of our land, Alex Salmond, now has the Alex Salmond Show on RT. What do you think?
Have you watched it?
Sorry?
Have you watched it?
I haven't seen it.
I made a point.
Set my alarm clock for that one.
I made a point of watching two of them because I was so, kind of appalled by the fact that he was doing it, and I wanted to see what he would do on these programs. I was appalled because I think that Alex Salmond insists that he has total editorial control over his own program. It's his own production company that makes the program. RT just broadcasts it. And I said, well, I believe you have total editorial control over your program the day you have some hardline opponent of Putin on it and are allowed to show it. And he certainly hasn't done that so far. So far he's done softball interviews with Jackie Stewart, the racing driver, or with Carles Puigdemont, the Catalan leader.
But before we open it for, what is Russia today? In your eyes, you've been inside the Kremlin, you've been a BBC journalist. A lot of people, well, obviously the MPs are queuing up to get paid £1,000 a time just to appear in it. But for those of us who are maybe a bit more principled or whatever, what do you think then about how much of a threat to the stability of the West does this pose a threat, as some people are claiming?
Well, certainly it's a propaganda channel. They do broadcast things that are perfectly acceptable. Not everything is unacceptable at all. And that's part of their strategy. They mix, perfectly decent stuff with stuff which, yes, I think is intended, I don't know if it's to destabilise, but certainly to give very alternative views on what's going on in the West. But are they important? Are they influential? I think not a bit. I mean, I don't know how many people in this hall watch or ever have watched RT.
Just as a show of hands, has anyone ever watched RT?
Oh my goodness, that's more than I thought. Well, okay.
It's those late nights when you've fallen asleep and your remote control is flicked through the channels. You wake up and there's this thing on it.
But
I actually confuse it with RTE in Ireland rather than television sharing, which is far better.
But can I put it this way? There's a big suggestion going around at the moment that the result of the Brexit referendum may have been skewed because of RT or because of tweets that Russian trolls put out. Now, to me, if you compare that with that big red bus promising £350 million to the NHS, I'm sorry.
But if they can't do it through RT, do you think, though, that Putin and his PR machine, whatever we want to call it, his propaganda machine, is destabilising Western democracies? Is there a danger of this that we should be alert to? I
think yes, it's clear that they interfered in the American election, which was much more important to them than anything in Britain, it has to be said. And I think the goal of their interference in the American election wasn't so much to bring Trump to power, although that was the effect of it. It was to undermine Hillary Clinton, who Putin hates. Putin is convinced that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State back in 2011, helped to foment the huge demonstrations that there were in the streets against Putin's rule at that time. And he can't stand her and would have done anything, I think, to undermine her campaign. Now, the byproduct of that was that if she didn't win, well, Trump was going to win. I very much doubt that what Russia did was enough to swing it. There were plenty of other reasons why Americans weren't impressed by Hillary Clinton's campaign and voted for whatever reasons for Donald Trump. And I imagine that Putin must regret now any efforts that they put into that, because I think he will be as appalled as everyone else is by Trump's behaviour. If there's one thing Putin wants in an American leader, it is somebody who he understands, at least, even if he doesn't agree with him, whose behaviour he can predict, and he's got Trump.
Well, I think we've all found that Donald Trump is predictably unpredictable. Right, now, I've said enough. I'm going to bell up and open it up to all you good people. And there's a gentleman there straight away in the front row, but the rest of you prepare your questions. Yes, sir?
Yes, of course. I've got several.
Is there a microphone or anything to go around? No.
My wife, Joanna, is Polish, and she's getting very agitated listening to you because she remembers the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And then Poland getting into the European Union.
We've got a microphone for you, sir. So
yes, this would be good. So we can all hear it.
Even better.
Well, I've already started. So my wife, Joanna, is Polish.
Sure.
She remembers the end of the Cold War.
Yes.
And then Poland getting into the European Union and things starting to get better. And then I knew Poland from about 6-7 years ago. And so last Monday, 8 o'clock, I think she made coffee. And she's talking to me about more horror stories about what's happening in Poland because of this right-wing government. And it's awful. And I suddenly, because I think quickly, sometimes I thought, hell, you've been telling me this for 2 years. And I reckon they're trying to set up a police state. And then, because I tried to think quickly, and half an hour later I thought, I wonder if they're working with the Russians. And it's an awful thought, but, it would suit them. and maybe some of these Polish guys on the right, the extremist men, would like to take back Vilnius, which was obviously Polish speaking, of course, and Vladimir would take over the rest of the Baltic states.
Right.
And he could, they run their war games.
Okay, well let us just see
Can I take that?
what he thinks about that. Remember, Poland is in Russia, so you...
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
there's a connection.
There is a connection. I mean, I think Poland's internal affairs are Poland's internal affairs, and the fact that they've elected this government is that I haven't seen anything to indicate that Putin has been in collusion with them. I mean, maybe there is. I just don't know. I haven't seen anything to that effect.
What about the war games up against the Baltic states border and in Belarus a few months ago?
Yeah.
Because the next time they do it, they can be over the border.
They could be if they wanted to, but I don't actually think that Putin has any ambition to invade those countries. I mean, for a start, they're members of NATO, and whatever Putin is, he's not crazy. He's not going to invade a...
Yeah, but in the context of Mr. Trump.
Right.
Meaning?
What would Mr. Trump say if that happened?
Well, nobody knows what Trump will say about anything, to be honest.
Right, I would like to hear what other people in the audience have to say, because there's a forest of hands. There's a man there with a checked shirt. I think it's one of our lecturers, Tom Scott, there. And then we'll come to the gentleman just a moment.
Yeah, no, I was wondering whether you might rather have underestimated the impact of RT, because it's not just RT, it's a whole network of kind of fake news. Literally hundreds of thousands of fake accounts on Facebook, on Twitter, pushing, quite well calculated fake news, which I think did have a big impact on the Brexit referendum.
Why do you think it had a big impact? I mean, how can one tell?
Well, it's very difficult because Twitter and Facebook are only just beginning to release data on that, and I don't think we've seen anything like the full extent of what was going on.
Yeah. My impression at the moment is that this is greatly exaggerated, I have to say. I'm sure it went on, but in terms of its impact, I think it's exaggerated. And it's being exaggerated because there is a huge amount of hysteria around in the West about Putin, and Western countries are taking some crazy decisions these days. I'm sorry if there are plenty of Brexit voters in the audience here. There probably are, but the Brexit vote, the swing towards right-wing parties in Germany and in France, the election of Trump in America. It's all part of a movement which is actually similar to the ideas that keep Putin in power in Russia, actually. But that doesn't mean that Putin is behind them.
But he is known to have actively sponsored far-right movements throughout Europe, including the Front National, the Golden Dawn in Greece. Yeah. I mean, it's not really...
Well, the Russian banks gave fairly small amounts of money to those parties. I think... I think it's a gross exaggeration to suggest that these phenomena would not happen if it weren't for Putin supporting them. I don't deny that Putin is supporting them, but,
I was just a bit worried when you mentioned there a Brexit that the man from Trigo isn't in the audience. But anyway, if we could just pass the mic along here to there's another gentleman, and then anyone else in the audience.
This is absolutely not political at all. Well, during your 40 years in Russia, I spent 20 years in the Far East in China. Do you think there's a specific psyche to a Russian that we in Anglo-Saxon and Frank areas don't quite understand? Or is something is it genetic or is it cultural?
It's a good question, and it's one that I've been trying to work out for about 40 years. No, and seriously, it's an endlessly puzzling and fascinating country. And at the end of the book, actually, in the last chapter of the book, I describe going back for 4 weeks, a couple of summers ago, and just sort of trying to, because I've had all this experience, I've seen Russians living under communism, under the changes, and under Putin and so on, and trying to work out what is it that makes them Russian, in what way are they different from us, and so on. and coming in the end to the conclusion that, you know, I don't really know. Obviously they are different, they have their own way of thinking, their own amazing culture and so on. You know, I mean, if you what I would love people to think, and especially if you read this book, my hope is that by the end of it you realise that with all this talk about Putin, Russia is not about Putin. Russia is the country that I have grown to love over all these years. It's the country of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Chekhov and Tchaikovsky and Kandinsky and Malevich and all these amazing cultural figures who've contributed so much to the world over the past 200 years. And the other thing that was brought home to me, I think, when I was sort of trudging around the streets, sort of looking at all the sort of monuments to the past and so on, and this is something that I think does describe something about the Russian way of thinking. Why do Russians think the way they do today and so on? Why do so many Russians support Putin, for instance, kind of bizarrely to us? If you think of the last 100 years, the 1917 revolution, the centenary has just passed. In those 100 years, the Russian people have gone through the revolution itself, the civil war that followed it, famine in the 20s and 30s, the purges under Stalin when millions were sent to the Gulag or got a bullet in the back of their heads. There was the Second World War when 25 million Russians perished, and the war for Russians wasn't like the war here. Britain was never invaded. We had bombs dropping on Britain, but in Russia, you had Gestapo on your streets, going through your cellars looking for people. There were gallows in the streets. Whole cities were destroyed. People were reduced to extreme hunger, eating book bindings and rats and so on. A horrendous experience that none of us actually have a clue about, really, you know. After the Second World War, you had more purges. Then Gorbachev came along and, you know, tried to liberalize everything, but actually the country got plunged into a whole new wave of turmoil, you know, and impoverishment and hunger again. If you think of all that together, it's like a nation with collective PTSD. And I think, you know, it's just worth bearing that in mind when we think of what the Russians are like today, you know, and the one thing Russians long for more than anything else is actually, and not just Russians, obviously, you know, all the nations who lived under communism for the last 45 years, because they all suffered the same thing. What they all long for more than anything else, I think, is just peace and stability. No more revolutions, no more invasions, and so on.
Right. Just like Brexit, Britain, isn't it? Right, now, we've got a young gentleman here.
Hi, I was just wondering what your take was on the current Crimean situation, because over the last few years, I feel like the stories on it have been...
All right, sorry, yeah.
The stories on it have been dropping more and more, and it's hard to even find anything on it nowadays.
Yeah.
Without looking really hard. And there's so many varying viewpoints. It's all about oil, it's all about nationalism, all that stuff. I wondered what your take was. And also, I wondered what your take was on the Chechnyan homosexual purges, or whatever they are.
Okay, so Crimea first. That, I mean, it's funny speaking to Russians about that, because almost all Russians support it, that Putin annexed Crimea. Almost all support it. Many of them support it with a caveat. They say the way he did it was wrong, of course, but yes, Crimea should be part of Russia because historically it was, and it was a kind of fluke when Khrushchev in 1954-56 passed it over to Ukraine at a time when it didn't really matter whether it was in Ukraine or in Russia because it was all part of the USSR. It's going to be such a difficult thing to resolve because it's interesting that, you know, there's a young woman called Ksenia Sobchak who she's a sort of celebrity in Russia who has decided to stand in the next presidential election next year, and she says that the annexation of Crimea was illegal. It's part of Ukraine. Everybody internationally recognises that. But what we should do is organise a proper legal, internationally supervised referendum in Crimea to decide what its fate should be. And that sort of makes sense. But yeah, I mean, that's going to be a thorn in the side of Russian-Western relations for a long time to come.
Because aren't they building a massive pipeline from the Black Sea there to Russia?
Is that including, did you say?
Aren't they building a massive pipeline from the Black Sea through Crimea into Russia?
An oil pipeline or what? What kind of pipeline?
Oil.
I'm not sure. I don't know. I know they're building a
this young man sounds as though he's a future BBC correspondent in Russia. Yes.
Shall I answer the second part of his question?
Oh, yes,
I mean, in Chechnya. I mean, Chechnya is out of control, even out of Putin's control. It's run by a crazy man called Kadyrov, who is basically a warlord, a thug, who, you know, if Russia's ambition when first Yeltsin and then Putin started a war against Chechnya, it was to keep Chechnya as part of the Russian Federation and stop it sort of going off on its own. Well, it's now nominally a part of the Russian Federation, but it's a kind of Islamic ruled country now, which only kind of in theory is subject to the Russian constitution. So many of the things they do there are illegal, even in the rest of Russia. And I mean, the situation with the treatment of gay men there is just absolutely horrific. Yeah.
Do you not think Putin should do more to rein in that problem?
I certainly think he should do more. The question is whether Putin can do more, because Kadyrov really runs this state on his own, and I think most people agree that Putin doesn't have much control over him at all. If he tried, I mean, when Boris Nemtsov was the opposition leader, was murdered by Chechens, the Kremlin sent FSB, secret police forces, in to try and arrest somebody in Chechnya, and they were driven out by Kadyrov's people. They've got no writ there at all.
Right. Just time for a couple more final questions. There's a gentleman who had his hand up at the back there with the beard, the white beard, looks a bit like Santa Claus.
Have you had any dealings with oligarchs?
Sorry, drop microphone.
Have you had any dealings with oligarchs? And could they have liberalised the economy without actually producing such inequality and obviously vast levels of corruption?
I haven't had much personal interaction with oligarchs. No, I did give one some media training once. But no, I mean, the way the oligarch class emerged under Yeltsin was again a sort of Western-sponsored reform where the country's resources were auctioned off to the highest bidders, and those with money bought up and accumulated all of Russia's resources, especially the oil and the timber, aluminium and so on, in their own hands, and became incredibly rich very quickly. And under Yeltsin, they became very politically influential as well. They owned the main television stations and so on. When Putin came to power, he said, I'm going to get rid of the oligarchs as a class, as he put it. And he got them together around a table and said to them, look, I don't mind if you hold on to your money. We'll forget about how you made your money. We know it was all dodgy money, but you can hold on to your money and you can make yourself as rich as you want, so long as you don't meddle in politics. That's my only condition. And basically that's been the situation ever since. The deal they have is that, unlike in the Yeltsin period, the oligarchs don't, I think, call the shots in Russian politics at all, which is why I think the West sometimes makes a mistake when it, for instance, imposes sanctions against oligarchs, thinking, oh yes, they're Putin's cronies and so on. If we hit them, we'll change Putin's mind. It doesn't work that way in the Kremlin. They are Putin's cronies. All the richest men. Russia is basically run by a kleptocracy. It's run by Putin and his closest friends, most of whom are extremely rich, having stolen the country's resources. But they don't make policy. On the contrary, Putin uses them whenever he needs them. For instance, for the Sochi Olympics, if he needs new stadiums built and so on. He says to his oligarchs, okay, I want you to finance this stadium, you to finance that, you're going to finance the new bridge to Crimea and so on. And they do it because otherwise they're going to be in trouble with Putin.
But what about the stories that Putin himself is incredibly rich and, you know, he's been pocketing it a lot and he's got all these airplanes and he's got all this.
Yeah.
How much credence do you lend to that?
I mean, to be honest, nobody knows the answer to that, really. Yeah. But my impression is that Putin runs Russia in a slightly different way. He's like a mafia boss. The mafia boss himself may not have dollars in his pockets. He doesn't need them because he is surrounded by cronies who do have all the money and who can provide anything he wants. If Putin wants to use a yacht, he can get it at the snap of his fingers, or a private plane, or anything he wants, because the oligarchy around him will give him that. I'm sure he does have millions, maybe billions somewhere or other, but maybe not as much personally as people think, because he actually, his money is power, the power he has over this sort of mafia below him.
Right, now we are really running out of time. Tom, you down here have got a question. We've got a microphone we can bring. I can shout.
Sorry, I have like, I've got a quick...
Oh, sorry, the mic's up there. Oh, sorry, you'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really inspiring to know that under communism, people were still managing to circulate like those forbidden cultures, like whether it's Solzhenitsyn or foreign radio. But today in Russia, do you still see that people are searching for alternative news? Is it still as important?
It's just a different situation now. I mean, there is scarcely any censorship in Russia today. It's not like China, where whole websites are closed down. There are some that are closed down, but they're actually not mainly political sites that are closed down. And I mean, it's interesting. You can, as I have done on several occasions, you can sit on the metro in Moscow, for instance, on an underground train where there is free Wi-Fi provided by the Moscow city government. You can log into the internet sitting on the train and look at as many anti-Putin websites as you like. You know, you can follow Navalny or anything you want. So in that sense, no, I mean, it's a free country in that sense. What isn't free is that there is no choice in elections. Because Putin will not allow serious candidates to stand against him, and if they do stand, they're not given airtime on television. So he controls it. If he wants to stand again next year, of course he will win the election. But it's not because people don't know what's going on if they want to, but especially through the internet. The vast majority of Russians get their news not from the internet, of course, but from first channel Russian television, which is Putin propaganda constantly. But I think Russia is changing in that sense, because younger people, there are more and more younger people around, they're using the internet more and more, so it becomes more and more difficult for Putin to control what information people get.
All right, talking about young people, we have to end with a question from a young Falmouth journalism student. Tom has had his hand up as well, so we'll make this final question.
I'd just like to know if you could speculate on what you think will happen when, if and when Putin steps down.
Well, it looks as if Putin will stand again next year for another 6 years. So he'll be around until 2024, probably. He's already been in power longer than Brezhnev was. And I don't know how many years it will be by 2024, but anyway, well, something like 24 years, actually. What he will try to do, I think, during his last term in office is to put in place his successor. And it's very hard to see at the moment. He doesn't seem to have lined anyone up as his successor so far. Back in 2007, when he had already done 2 terms in office, and so he had to stand down under the constitution, he maneuvered Dmitry Medvedev into the position to become president for 4 years, and then they swapped back again. He's not going to be able to do that again. He's just going to be too old by then. But he will want to make sure that whoever takes over from him, and he'll want to manage that process, that person, A, will guarantee his own security, He'll want some sort of immunity from prosecution for all the corruption and wealth that he certainly has.
Mugabe, yeah.
Absolutely. And secondly, he will want his successor to continue his policies, especially in the sense of, when Putin came to power, his big motto was, it's like Trump actually, he wanted to make Russia great again. He wanted to make Russia count on the world stage again. And I think, in his terms, he probably thinks he's more or less achieved that now. In the Middle East, Russia is a big player now and so on. Sorry, I'm going on a bit long here, but just...
well, I was going to say just on this, talking about continuity, Angus has very kindly agreed to continue the conversation with whoever wants to continue up in the bar. Well, he is Scottish, but he's not buying you all a drink, by the way, just to stress that. He's from Aberdeen, I should stress that. But seriously, Angus is very keen to carry on the conversation. We have this wonderful Christmas stocking filler called Moscow Calling. You can get a signed copy for that awkward relative or anyone else that you think should be reading this. But for now, I just want to take time just briefly to say I hope you'll all keep surfing truthfile.com, spread the news about this wonderful site created and produced by Falmouth Journalism students. But most of all, at the moment, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking Angus Roxburgh for the fascinating insights he's given us today to the world's largest country, and indeed to the extreme challenges of trying to cover such a place journalistically. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.